Welcome to Resolutions, the official podcast of the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution. Every episode is a journey into the heart of conflict resolution, guided by our diverse community of experts. We're here to explore innovative strategies, share wisdom from the field, and inspire excellence in resolving disputes. Whether you're a dispute resolution professional, a curious learner, or someone passionate about fostering understanding and peace, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's conversation and discover how we can transform conflict into opportunity together.
Well, Grande, Becky, thank you so much for joining us on Resolutions. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I guess we should start here because I'm sure that there are folks listening who know of CRS, know of Community Relations Service, but couldn't quite pinpoint what the agency is all about. I might start with Grande, just because of the extent to which you've written about the evolution of CRS. What is CRS to the layperson?
Well, CRS stands for the Community Relations Service. It is an agency within the Department of Justice. Was created by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title 10. You're at Texas, UT Austin, and Lyndon Baines Johnson was the primary leader and driving for it. So since it was created because of the concern about segregation and what would happen after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that you couldn't litigate your way out of it. So the idea was to send conciliators, what we'll call conciliators or mediators, especially at that time, to the South to work on that. And it was, very successful. And then, you go through a 60+ year history of being involved in many of the most significant civil rights events in this country, including from Selma, the March from Selma to Montgomery, the Boston public schools desegregation, and the public schools desegregation across the country, to Rodney King, to Elian Gonzalez, to a number of things, Trayvon Martin, certainly George Floyd, all those, some many of them tragedies, but CRS played an important role in that. And then because of the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act in 2008, and Becky led really initially the first really significant expansion of the jurisdiction to cover beyond race and ethnicity to things like gender, sexual orientation, religion, and disability here. And it's played an incredibly important role behind the scenes in conciliating, in mediating, in facilitating, in working through the challenges, civil rights challenges of the day.
What do you think, for each of you, maybe I'll start with Becky, drew you to the CRS's work, to become a senior leader in the organization? Why join it?
I think that the power of the Community Relations Service comes from the people that we serve. And I think that there is something inherently attractive about that to anyone who's committed to justice and committed to sustainable change with respect to civil rights. CRS was created out of the recognition that the power to really address civil rights issues resides in the people who are most affected by civil rights violations. So I cannot imagine a better job than to work at an organization or work at an agency that is empowered by the government to make sure people have access to the opportunity to shape the policies and practices that make their communities stronger and safer. At its fundamental core, CRS is based on the idea that the wisdom to address civil rights issues resides in the community. And I think that is a very powerful idea that really kind of, for me, captures the power of government.
Grande, what drew you?
It really combined two of the things I've been most passionate about in my career. I think it was, civil rights, and especially the point of what do communities, what do individuals do to empower themselves. I think Becky said it incredibly articulately. And in dispute resolution, I came to dispute resolution because I believed in the power to help people do it, and I felt it myself when I did the work, and it kept going there. And when I discovered CRS, like wow, here's a really unique organization within the federal government that was charged with that to do that. And I did not know much of the history until I read Bertram Levine's book and then started to talk to people, like Ron Wakabayashi to learn more about the organization. And I was just astounded at the difference uh, the tools can make when working on these really difficult issues and the positive outcomes that can come from that.
And I
One
would
of
just,
the,
oh, so I was just going to add to what
no,
Grande said,
sure.
it reminded me of something too. Something Grande said earlier is that we are not going to litigate our way out of all of these issues. I absolutely, as a civil rights attorney, feel very strongly that litigation is an important tool. But to Grande's point, this recognition that if we are truly going to address civil rights issues in this country, we have to make sure that the people who are most affected are at the table to, and that's what CRS can do.
One of the interesting things that I learned preparing for this, and it came, I think, from Grande's own research, was in these heady times of the civil rights movement in the 60s, there was a moment where a CRS official, after helping mediate the Selma related matters, was eventually marching, was eventually part of the march. And I can only imagine in a social media age how something like that might have been received. I think it's easy for us to think, well, he's trying to ensure safety, or just make sure that this goes off without a hitch. But in an age where perception often eclipses reality, I think people might jump to some conclusions. So I guess I wonder how you think CRS managed to effectively stake out space as a neutral third party doing this incredibly important and contentious work.
If I could start, you were referring actually to Leroy Collins, who was the first director, and he was captured in a picture with Martin Luther King and Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy. It cost him then. We didn't need social media because when he later runs for senator in Florida, the Republican a Republican person campaigning for governor used that picture and put it in billboards across the state, and he blamed it for why he lost that race. He never regretted it. He never regretted the work. I would say it is perception does matter, Larry. I think that's true, and there is in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, if you break confidentiality, you're subject to a $1,000 fine and 1 year in prison. No one in CRS has ever had to do that, So I think it goes to one point of saying you have to be very careful. You have to be concerned about the perceptions, and you have to be concerned about the reality of being seen by all parties as being fair. And that's everyone, right? That is the civil rights groups, the protesters, that are the community leaders, the people who live in that community, to the mayors, city managers, police departments. And I think that's been a huge strength. There often aren't people who have that ability to be perceived as a fair broker in those situations. And by, I think, being careful and by building strong relationships, because CRS has had offices throughout the country, those folks are known to all the different stakeholders or players within a situation. But it is something that I think in Becky's time and in my time, people thought about it a lot, people cared about it a lot, and that's half the game. You really got to think through how you're going to be perceived and how you can be perceived in an objective, fair, nonpartisan manner.
I think that's all right, and that is all correct. And I think Grande, one of the great things that Grande brought to the agency is because he has this fantastic experience and background as one of the nation's leaders in terms of thinking about conflict resolution. And I think when we talk about what are the core principles of conflict resolution, how do you sort of institutionalize that in a government agency with respect to neutrality and a lack of bias? And so I do think, to Grande's point, I spent a lot of time when I first came to CRS really looking at the Civil Rights Act of 64 that created CRS and highlighting that piece where it is critical that CRS be recognized as an independent, as not connected to any agency. By statute, we cannot be connected to investigations or prosecutions. And what I used to tell people is that, especially when you're in an agency like the Department of Justice, the inability to prosecute or investigate could be perceived as a weakness, but it was really our greatest strength because it gave us this ability to gain entry into communities and to earn trust as a neutral because we could not be used as a tool to investigate or prosecute. And I saw it time and time again, and I think you would see it in communities because we would get calls from police chiefs, from mayors, as well as from civil rights advocates. We were getting calls from people from across the board with respect to their role in a community, but also political orientation. People were calling when they wanted to reduce the potential for violence, and we responded whoever reached out. And I think that's a big piece of it. The other thing, and Grande referred to this a little bit earlier, there's some extraordinary people who came through CRS, people who, like Ron Wakabayashi, like Tom Battles, people who were regional directors that built all these relationships across their lifetime with communities. And because they lived that commitment to have an unbiased approach to this work, they were therefore able to sort of make sure that the agency maintained that reputation as well.
I want to just return to your own individual experiences at CRS, and I'm curious if you can each think of, an episode, a moment where you were working on something, and I want to respect CRS's need for privacy, confidentiality, and understand that, but a particular project, a particular episode of your work where you came away from it thinking, wow, this is why we need CRS. This is why CRS adds value. This is why it matters.
Becky, you want to start?
Sure. I was thinking of two different sort of times during my time when I was acting director at CRS. One was after Trayvon Martin was murdered, and the Community Relations Service was on the ground in Sanford before anybody else. And the reason was that Tom Battles, who was the regional director who covered Florida, had the relationships with the NAACP branches. He was the person they reached out to and said, we think there's something that something happened here that we need to focus on. No one is paying attention to the fact that this young Black child was murdered. Can you respond? Can you do something? And it was Tom who was one of the first people who people were reaching out to. And what I saw there with respect to the response from CRS was, and again, this was all publicly available information, so I can speak to it. We had the ability, because of those relationships, but also because of the training and also because of the life experience of our conciliators, we could get into Sanford and work with the sheriff's department. We were hearing from advocates. We were helping, they were young advocates that were marching across Florida in protest of what had happened to Trayvon Martin. And they were marching through white supremacist hotbeds of where there were sort of white nationalists that could have targeted them. We were there to make sure that people could stay safe during those protests. The other thing I want to highlight is during that protest, the other person who reached, the people who reached out, it was the local advocates. We heard from someone in Sanford, Florida. The reason we heard from someone in Sanford, Florida was that he was a mediator. We've talked a lot. So, Andrew Thomas, who's received many awards, I think, from the ABA, as he should have, is sort of a real legend, I think, in terms of mediation. He had moved to Sanford in theory to retire. I always tease him. He didn't retire very well because he worked very hard. And he was working with Sanford. He knew about the ongoing tension with community and law enforcement. He was the one who said, we need to do something. And we need to do something. And this is what I think is the real power of CRS. Not only to make sure that people stay safe during these protests and marches, but we need to talk about the longer standing systemic issues that are leading to these protests. It is not only the horror at the murder of a child. It is that there are longstanding issues around discrimination that need to be addressed. And so I think when I think about CRS, I think about people like Andrew Thomas, local government level. I think about extraordinary mediators who were on the ground, who I saw. I can still see the image in my mind. We were on the ground. Our team had been there since 5:30 in the morning. Most mornings we would meet with the sheriff's department early on. How are you going to de-escalate? Meeting with advocates. At one point in time, there was the new Black Panther Party was on the ground, and there was somebody from the sheriff's office who was saying, they're here, I don't know what they want. I'm concerned that this is going to lead to something violent. And literally one of our mediators went over and said, what is it you want? And they said, we're just trying to find a place for a press conference. And she went back and told the sheriff who, I just have this image because the sheriff deputy was physically quite large and sort of really, but he was really worried. And our mediator, she was probably 5 feet tall, and said, here's what's going on. They just want to do a press conference. And he was like, oh, well, that's fine. They can just go there and it'll be, and there was this opportunity, there was a potential for a misunderstanding, and it was addressed. During the protests around Sanford, there were no arrests, there was not violence, there was a lot of action by advocates that did lead to systemic change. Sanford developed a point-by-point plan to address inequity in their city, so that what happened in Sanford not only addressed the sort of immediate needs of the community, but it also made sure that there was a long-standing change in terms of addressing the issues that were brought forward during that time. So I think about that, and I was just so fortunate to work with the experts that were there, because we had people who CRS just responded right away, was on the ground, had advocates training people in the community, creating God squads, which are sort of religious leaders who can help to de-escalate, really respecting the fact that as the feds, we could come in and support and make sure that the community had the ability to do what it could do best, which was to know its community, to help reduce the potential for violence, and then to sort of drive longer standing change. So that's something that will always stay sort of in my mind when I think of CRS and what it can do, not only again in the short term, but in the longer term as well.
And Larry, why I wanted Becky to go first, you didn't give us the questions beforehand, so we did not know you were going to ask this question. But I was thinking maybe Becky would talk about Sanford, because it is, and she was on chair as director. It crossed our administrations, I guess I would say, and I think Becky's underselling her own role in this as the leader of CRS in a very challenging period in what she did coming down to Sanford, and certainly in working with the Martin family when they came to DC in a hearing at Congress as well here. And yeah, the one thing I'd add on that, and then I'll go to a different story, because Becky did such a wonderful job with that, is that Andrew Thomas, as Becky was saying, was incredibly important. Sort of on the ground Thomas battles was also certainly very significant in that. The mayor, was Jeff, I forget his last name now. Triplett, yes. The late Mayor Jeff Triplett, the city manager Norton Bonaparte, they really relied on Thomas here in this situation to work with that, but they worked in partnership, and I think there was a welcoming of National Action Network with Al Sharpton and with Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, in a way that allowed for the groups to practice their First Amendment right to free speech, and also to keep things safe as well. And the wonderful thing to see was it also helped put into place the ability to make actual change over time since that happened here. So I would absolutely go there. I would go with two situations. Larry, I thought you just asked a really terrific question to really think through what in our times did we really feel the impact. I would start with what happened after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. It was certainly similar in some ways and very different in other ways. In the Trayvon Martin situation, it took a while before the country heard about it, even though it becomes the most reported story of that year. Very different in Michael Brown. So, Michael Brown gets killed, gets murdered, and In a similarly, a couple of folks, Derek Dean and Rita Valenciano, get contacted by community groups on the ground in Ferguson. They drive from Kansas City to Ferguson. But social media really does play a different sort of role here, where it becomes viral and goes widespread, and there are protests immediately, and when they arrive on the scene, they're told that they can't even go into the street because it's too dangerous to go out there. But they then work endlessly and talk to many people on the ground to get a sense of what's going on, and really for months on end spend time for almost a year's time in Ferguson. Again, echoing the point Becky made, is the persistence and the passion and the commitment these conciliators have is incredible here. As we remember, there was a lot of problems in Ferguson, and at one point, Eric Holder, the then Attorney General, makes a decision to go to Ferguson to help calm things down and bring the tension down. He has said himself that it was the most difficult decision he had to make as Attorney General. And in the situation, because the CRS was the first federal agency on the ground, CRS had many of the connections to many of the community leaders and protesters there. And we were asked to do a number of things for his visit, to actually arrange 4 different meetings on that day within 48 hours here. So we arranged a meeting at the local community college with residents. We arranged a meeting with a more private meeting with young people from Ferguson, and also later a lunch with other folks as well. And the team was amazing in making this happen, and in having a very tense situation to try to really help it. And I remember being very anxious on that day, what would happen that evening after we did all these things. And it went really smoothly. I facilitated the town hall with Attorney General Holder, and he was amazing. He talked about his own personal experience being stopped by police on the New Jersey Turnpike, and say he could see that. And his brother was a policeman as well. He visited the police, as the Ferguson area police as well. And that day, I remember being still very anxious of what was going to happen, and it was calm. It really did make an impact. So that, echoing what Becky said, there was the short term, like there's a real important part. I could see the power of how important, why CRS is so critical. And then there's the bigger picture. And I won't go too much more into here, but then the ongoing work to reduce tension, the ongoing work to help the community heal. It was also important. And I got to see a number of engagement activities there. Second piece I'll just go into real briefly. Because of the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, CRS made a decision to do training for the treatment of transgender individuals by law enforcement, and made a decision to create a training video for police officers to do it. It was, I think, the first video on transgender issues within the federal government. It was not easy at that time to get the approvals necessary to do it. What I remember most is, my own ignorance in the situation of, okay, great, let's bring together the civil rights organizations that deal with transgender issues, and let's have them meet with the police departments so we can start doing this. And I think it was Daphne Felton Green, who was my chief of staff, said, they're not ready to do that. They're not ready to sit down with police departments. So then I think, oh, I get it. And we really treated it like a mediation or facilitation. You got to meet with the group separately. You have to really understand the issues. It was a slower process than one might, what I thought it was going to be initially here. And, but I still also remember bringing the advocacy groups to DOJ, and I was struck. A number of them said to me, "This is the first time we've been invited to DOJ. We've come for larger LGBTQ meetings on that, but it's the first time specifically on this issue." And it was so meaningful to them, and I could see that. And it was a really wonderful collaboration with a lot of parties. But to me, that was also something that was really important that really made me understand the impact of CRS.
Really appreciate those memories and the clarity with which you both remember them. One of the reasons that I thought it would be important for us to have this conversation is some external conversations about the future of CRS. And so here's one of the ways I want to come at that question, because I'm sitting here talking with the two of you. It's clear that these issues still matter to you, that, despite the fact that you're no longer part of CRS, you still deeply care about civil rights and dispute resolution. So I guess I wonder if you can separate a little bit the need for mediation and conciliation and facilitation in the spaces that we're talking about from the need for a federal agency funded by taxpayers that does that work. Because I can picture a collection of people who work for CRS and then go on to future work still being engaged in similar work. But I suspect that both of you would have reason to think that their work would be received differently or done differently or land differently if they were part of CRS and the Department of Justice.
I think, I do think it's an important question, and it's one that I heard a lot. I actually remember when I was leading CRS, we would get international visitors who would just sort of be shocked that there was this office that was at the federal government charged with doing this. And what I would explain to them and what I saw, and that what I've explained to local officials and state officials, is that the role of CRS as a federal agency coming from the Department of Justice, it was imbued with so much more ability to get people to come to the table. So there is a real role, and I think there's a real statement from the federal government to say, we at the federal government are committed to civil rights enforcement. We are committed to civil rights, and we are committed to sort of listening to communities. And we are, the fact is, under the Civil Rights Act of 64, this office was created because it was recognized that it is an appropriate role for the federal government to make sure that the people that we serve, the people who, at the end of the day, every federal government official serves people in this country, that those folks have a lot of wisdom and power, and that it is our role to make sure that we are listening to them and we are providing with them with an opportunity to speak and to be heard. So I think, while I think that there's a lot of value at the state level, I was recently helped to start something similar to CRS, but at the state level in California. I think those are great and important offices, and I think there's a role for them, but there is no question that the federal government, we would come into a community where there was tension, and if it was sometimes in the aftermath of a hate crime, for example, there is so much pain in a community. Our role would be to come in, because often the tension and the pain around a hate crime quickly changes into tension between, for example, law enforcement and the community, because they feel like there's not an effective response. For us to gain entry there, the fact that we're coming from the federal government, we're coming from the Department of Justice, meant that it felt more comfortable for a police chief to call us and say, hey, I need some help here. I want to keep the peace here. Can you help me to do this work? And at the same time, it gave us the access to other parties. So I think it's really important that the federal government continue to have that commitment. And it's also a smart one. It helps, when we think about sort of the arguments for why we need CRS, we absolutely need the expertise and the ability to sort of help to create, to help to reduce the potential for violence. We have shown time and time again we can do it. It saves money. It is a smart, it is smart to try and think about how we kind of de-escalate tension. And it really is sort of, it is a demonstration by the federal government that we actually are putting our money where our mouth is, and our actions where where our beliefs are, and that we genuinely believe and we trust that communities have wisdom to address these issues, and we are going to do what we can to make sure that they have a seat at the table. And I think that is a role that really only the federal government can play at that level. I think it can absolutely collaborate and should collaborate with state agencies, local agencies, but I think there's a real role for the federal government there.
I'd absolutely agree, and I think both are true, right? Going back to Larry, your question, it is wonderful to have folks who do this work leaving aside the federal government for a moment. And we don't have enough of that right now. First of all, I would say, Larry, you and I have been in the mediation work, for a long time, as Becky. Um, and it's hard to do the work that you passionately care about. When I tried to do it, I'd have to make sure there was funding to do it if I was doing it as a private mediator. It's certainly hard in the state context to have a budget as well, and it's just too late. You're trying to get to do that. So I think it's important that we have folks who are able to do it and finding ways to compensate the wonderful people who do the work here. On the federal agency of the YCRS, in addition to what Becky said, there is an ability to be a convener. It's hard to be the convener in these situations with so many disparate parties, with so many concerns about it. We have certainly, I think all three of us have seen situations where it was really hard to agree who the mediator or facilitator should be because everybody didn't like what the other, there was a reacted evaluation of anybody being provided here. And CRS, because of two things, right? Both because it has this federal imprimatur. I think there is a certain power to that, especially let's say for law enforcement, for elected officials. It can provide this effectiveness, and certainly for community leaders, community members, civil rights groups, and protesters. There is a benefit that this is a federal government agency. So that's one piece of it. Secondly, certainly, whether it's the Thomas Battles or Justin Locks or Rita Valencianos, all these wonderful people, they've built these relationships throughout their whole career, and it's so hard to have that combination of people who have that network, who have that experience, who have that skill, but for the fact that they can reside in a federal agency and do that work and build it over time. It's really hard, as we all know, to do it on your own, looking for grants or trying to do it. And certainly states, I think they can be, we can talk about this a little bit later, but we're working on, we're working on a class I'm going to be teaching in the fall, Policy Lab at Stanford Law School, where we look at the absence of CRS, the absence of the Federal Mediation Conciliations Service, and the absence of these agencies. Who can fill it? It would certainly have to be partially filled by whatever state agencies currently exist or might be created in response to this. So I think it's absolutely important as well.
I just want to pull on one thread here, and that is the notion of the weight, maybe I should say, that the federal government can carry as a convener, because I guess I wonder, situated as I am in a city that is of, I think, a certain political stripe and may feel a certain way about the current, office holders, word of the federal government showing up might be received in other ways. And I can imagine the flip side when President Biden or President Obama were in office, the federal government being received side-eyed, in precincts that voted for Republican candidates. I don't know if either of you have thoughts about that, about how CRS has managed to mitigate some of that.
I mean, I thought about that a lot actually when I was at CRS, because even I served under President Obama, and even there, you're still the government. I mean, I used to talk to folks all the time about that. You can say, I'm a civil rights lawyer. When I would talk to civil rights attorneys, I would say, yes, I hear you, and you are still the government, and the government has still caused some pain in this community. So I think I think part of the way we did that was, to Grande's point, the people who are working, a really important part, I think, of CRS is the regional office structure, because you have people who develop those relationships over time in the community, and they can then be trusted as, yeah, they're part of the federal government, but they are a little bit different. It is also critical that we maintain that sort of, again, going back to, I think they were wise in the Civil Rights Act of 64 to put those provisions in that you can go to prison if you share information that was meant to be kept confidential. So another way that CRS, I think, helps to maintain sort of its ability to go into situations where people don't necessarily trust any government, including the federal government, is that we we cannot share that information, that if you know, that we cannot investigate, we cannot prosecute. So I think all of that is true. I also think it just requires a lot of humility, and that we can try and go in, and if we are not the right ones, that's the other piece of what we can do, is we have these regional offices who know other folks who might be able to come in and help to mediate. So I think it's all true that often we were able to maintain that sufficient credibility in the community to come in, even if people didn't trust us because of whoever was in power. And I think we hire and have a team of people who have the humility to recognize that sometimes it's not us, but because we have access to some information about what's going on, we may be able to help facilitate still other folks who can come in to mediate.
I would add by saying, I mean, first of all, let me acknowledge it is a problem. The fact that there is greater political polarization that leads people to react in a certain way based on who's in office is a problem. And it's certainly not CR specific. It is a much bigger issue that is going to be that's real. So I first would acknowledge that. And secondly, I would say, we used to say all politics are local. And then once you get down to the city level, once you get down to the neighborhood level, we're all using federal services, right? We are all still getting our mail. We're all still getting our Social Security. We're all still using it. And so in many situations, and certainly in my experience, I would say we would go into areas where that had Republican mayors or had sheriffs or police chiefs who were often likely, I didn't necessarily ask, or might have been Republican. But because CRS conciliators had excellent reputations, they would welcome the work. They would welcome folks in regardless of their partisan views in a situation. I very much think that has been the case in its 60+ year history. That allows for that sort of success. Absolutely, when we jump to thinking of it at the federal level and we read the news or look at our phones and get upset by what the other side is saying, it's very real. And at the same time, when we're having a problem in our neighborhood around some issue of what happened in a farmer's market here, we just want to resolve it because there's something very positive that's going on in a community that's been derailed, and we want to bring it back together. And CRS's conciliators are welcome.
As I say, I mean, there is also, though, the backdrop of this current federal government taking a position on the future of CRS. And I wanted to just give the two of you an opportunity to share some work you're doing to, potentially preserve the CRS and to continue its work in the face of some stiff pressure to have the agency close.
I don't know, Grande, if you, I mean, Grande and I have been working together, but Grande's been doing a lot of work. And, I was really fortunate to serve in CRS during the Obama administration. And when we left during the first Trump administration, there was also discussion about trying to get rid of CRS. And at that point in time, I was working with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights. And we did a lot of advocacy with legislators and others to help people understand the importance of CRS. And I think that's kind of what we're up to again this time, is making sure that we are working there. The good thing about CRS is that it has created so much goodwill in many communities. It has made a difference in communities. It has demonstrated its worth to a lot of people in terms of advocates and others, that they have been really receptive to making sure when we address the different harms that this administration is inflicting, on the country, that the loss of CRS it would be a devastating blow, not only to, I think, the rule of law. The Civil Rights Act of '64 is very clear. It creates the Community Relations Service, and eliminating it through one line in a reorganization proposal, it doesn't cut it. But also that of all the times in our country when we have this kind of polarization that you were referring to earlier, Larry, this is when we need CRS. And so not only is, I think, the removal of it contrary to the Civil Rights Act of '64 and to the very principles that make our country strong, it's going to harm our communities. And so I think that's some of the work we've been doing. But yeah, Grande, I'll turn over to you because you've been doing a lot more work as well. So.
Yeah, thank you, Becky, and along with a few others as well. We care about CRS. We want it to survive, and we want it to succeed here. And Becky's done incredible work with the leadership conference of civil rights on that because of having been a civil rights attorney and having been a part of these organizations. Certainly in addition. I mean, we're looking at the advocacy level of getting folks to advocate. So whether it's congressional members or other people who've been elected in office, getting them to support CRS in various situations, whether in hearings or in other platforms as well. Certainly, we've looked hard at the litigation prong of this as well, and have been talking to some law firms about this. Unfortunately, yesterday, it seems like forever already, there's a Supreme Court decision that basically allows for the continued elimination, at least temporarily, right? It took that stance, but that's not good from that perspective. But it is looking at whether it's a community that's been harmed who would have standing to saying they're no longer receiving CRS services here. The agency is down to just over a dozen employees at this moment. So potentially, if there is a reduction in force that actually takes place likely within this next month or so, we'll see what happens. Whether they're employees, they would have standing here as well. There's a case around the Department of Homeland Security where they had a couple of offices that were ombuds offices here, and a lawsuit was filed by the Southern Border Communities Coalition, the Urban Justice Center, and it was successful. It put pressure on federal government to reverse the decision. So I think that is our hope, is that we can push for that. Certainly, there's been some writing, op-eds. That's another piece of it, is to get news coverage of it as well here. So, we are doing our best. We want to see this incredibly important office survive and thrive in the future.
I think to Grant's, I will just say there's a lot of us doing this work. Like there's a lot of people who are jumping in, and whether it's from more recently people who were in the administration or who were in CRS, or formerly from years ago. You aren't the same after you work at CRS and see the power of this kind of community civil rights mediation. And so I think we're a couple of folks among many who see its value and are doing what we can.
Just parenthetically, it's to this observer anyway, a little bit ironic to have you all find yourself in a situation where you've spent much of your career in mediation and conciliation, and now litigation has become front and center. And I say that not in judgment, just in observation. Let me end on this, because obviously, as part of the dispute resolution section, we definitely know that some of our listeners will be practitioners in the field. They may be teaching dispute resolution. But they're more than likely very supportive of what CRS has been and is. What do you want them to either know or do at this moment as it relates to CRS?
First of all, I want, especially folks who are training the next generation of mediators and conciliators, I want them to know about CRS and the way in which you can use mediation and conciliation to truly to make our country a little bit closer to its true founding values. So I want people to know about that opportunity. And then please, and I know this sounds like what people are saying all the time, but it's really true. Reach out, talk to, whether it's your local government officials and say, like, this is a really important office to us, but please go to your representatives and to your senators and say, this matters to us. And this agency, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, we believe in the ability of our communities to make decisions about what is best for our communities and how to advance and protect civil rights. And so reaching out and saying the community relations service needs to stay. Cutting the community relations service is not only against the law, but it is also it is going to harm our community is going to harm where we are, I think that is really important. And I mean, I cannot imagine a more exciting career for folks who, especially, people who are coming up and if you're training new conciliators and mediators, they ought to have the opportunity to serve their country in this way.
Good. Absolutely agree. I think I've done a lot of different types of mediation and dispute resolution, and this has touched, my heart and my sense of what is needed and what the country is all about here. If for sure, if individuals should certainly talk and write to their congressional members, as old-fashioned as that sound. If they want to write something about it, there are a lot of people with podcasts and blogs they can like Larry are doing right here. So we very much appreciate that. I'd also give a shout out to the Ohio State's Divided Community Project, where both Becky and I served as director. They have been doing incredible work and have been involved a lot of people who are in dispute resolution in a number of ways, through the Bridge Project, where they actually work with communities, to steering committees, to symposiums that they've done. That's a way a lot of folks from the section actually have been engaged and can certainly engage as well here. There's so much to be learned here, and I've been heartened by folks from the section in how supportive they've been, and would welcome it. If folks want to contact me and to talk further, I'd be happy to really have a conversation of what can be done and what needs to be done.
Well, a lot does, but we will watch and see what comes next. But in the meantime, Grande and Becky, thank you so much for being with us on Resolutions. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Resolutions. Today's episode has illuminated the powerful impact of effective dispute resolution and showcased the incredible individuals who dedicate themselves to this important work. Our mission is to explore the diverse world of dispute resolution, and we hope we've inspired you to engage with conflict and collaboration in new ways. If you're not yet a member of the ABA section of dispute resolution, we invite you to join our community of professionals making a difference. Your involvement can help us build a more harmonious society together. And if you found value in our conversations, please consider leaving us a review and a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback helps us reach more people and continue our journey towards excellence in dispute resolution. Until next time, keep solving problems, building bridges, and creating positive changes in your communities.